evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Justin Robinson. I'm the first Vice President of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. And it gives me tremendous pleasure to welcome you to the first lecture in our series. I have memories as a PhD student in England. My supervisor asked me to give a lecture on his behalf to a museum in the Midlands. And I got there a bit early, and when I got there, the treasurer was giving his report, and he was reporting that they had done very well for the year, things had turned around. In fact, they had done so well that next year they will be able to afford better speakers for their annual meeting. Now, today we don't have that problem. We have one of the finest speakers in the Caribbean, and I would say the world. And our lecture today is being delivered by one of the most distinguished living historians, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles. And we are breaking all kinds of rules today because you often say that you save the best for last, but we are starting with the best. And I'm going to ask our director to come and give a brief overview of our 2020 lecture series.
Believe me, I'm very happy to welcome you all tonight, but I know that you're actually here for another speaker, so I'll try to be brief. But it was important that Barbadians have continually impacted the world historical stage through our contributions to politics, art, music, but nowhere has our influence been more pervasive than through the establishment of our communities abroad. We invite you to join us as we explore the establishment of some key Barbadian migration settlements abroad in diverse countries, such as Cuba, Brazil, Panama, the UK, and the United States. Learn how our fellow countrymen have contributed to political, social, and cultural landscapes all over the world, and how these migratory movements have been felt here at home. Come, let us gather and learn our migration story. It seems fitting that we start this year's lecture series with a nod to last year's lectures, very successfully charting this particular process. That lecture series prominently featured Caribbean migration to Britain in the year of the 70th anniversary of its inception, actually the formal recognition of it, the Windrush generation. And we looked then at Barbadian migration to the UK. Professor Sir Hilary Beckles has kindly consented to deliver this inaugural lecture with a look at post-war migration to the UK. We also thought it pertinent to include our close relations across the region by looking at major instances of migration which have featured Barbadians, and therefore we will examine some key migratory moments or movements to the Guyanas and to Trinidad with Professor Pedro Welch, and to Cuba with Dr. Sharon Marshall in April. No story of Barbadian migratory movement would be complete without examining how we have established communities in the Americas, and the series therefore considers Barbadian migration to Brazil with Dr. Frederick Alleyne on March 25th, and to Panama with Professor Velma Newton on April 8th. Our examination of Barbadian migration to the Americas moves from Latin America to mainland USA with our final lecture delivered by Dr. David Brown on April 15th. The Barbados Museum and Historical Society is therefore pleased to partner once again in this annual lecture series with the University of the West Indies to deliver, again, what we think is an extremely important and fundamental understanding of how we came to be who we are today in this lecture series. We are therefore pleased also to say that we are able to partner with the Barbados government through the offices of the Prime Minister and the We Gathering initiative to feature those Barbadians who are the focus of that movement. We welcome you here to learn, and we welcome our brothers and sisters home, and we seek to understand their experiences both here at home and abroad. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing Sir Hilary deliver his remarks.
Yeah, thanks, Alexandra. So tonight's lecture is entitled Barbados to the World, Exploring the Origins and Legacy of Barbadian Migration, Barbadians in the UK after 1945. Now, I have the unenviable task of introducing Sir Hilary, and I shall spare you going through his biography in detail, because we could be here all night, but he needs no introduction. Professor Sir Hilary Beckles is currently the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, and before assuming this office on May 1st, 2015, he served the university as Professor of Economic History, Pro-Vice Chancellor for Undergraduate Studies, and Principal of the Cave Hill campus in Barbados for 13 years, from 2002 to 2015. So Hilary has had a distinguished career as an academic, international thought leader, United Nations committee official, and global public activist in the field of social justice and minority empowerment. And he's here in many of those roles, but I went to a conference in Cuba in 2013, and as we were milling around, people heard I was from UWI, and they said, "Oh, who's in charge?" So Hilary, and said, "Oh, well, he is." And they started a debate as to whether or not he was the greatest living historian. So I'm going to introduce him to give his lecture tonight as certainly the greatest living Caribbean historian. So Hilary.
Thank you, Justin and Sandra. I certainly will not accept that designation. Not in a company of so many of my distinguished colleagues and the history fraternity of this island and this region of which I am just a part. But it really is an honor to give this lecture and to be a part of this conversation. I must say, though, I would rather have given the lecture on Guyana for many reasons. But for two, Pedro, I envy you. For two reasons in particular. A very painful moment a few years ago when my bank called and said, "Listen, you need to bring some money and put into your account because your account is empty. And we have lots of checks that we cannot honor." And I thought that was very strange, so I rushed down to find out what was going on. And after an hour of investigation, discovered that there was a young man by the name of Hilary Beckles who had come from Guyana and was working on the Four Seasons project, and somehow all of my money ended up in his account. and I have been looking for him, and we have been looking for him ever since. But there's even more. My predecessor, Vice Chancellor Nigel Harris, admitted to feeling a sense of trepidation each time he heard my name. And we'll be having a meeting. He's a Vice Chancellor. I'm the principal of the Cave Hill campus. And I would say, Hilary Beckles present, and he would jump. Because one of my great uncles, who had studied in England and returned to this island and couldn't get a job teaching, because in the 40s and so on, it was very difficult for black people with a university degree to get a job here. And so he emigrated to Guyana, where he became the principal of Queen's College and taught an entire generation of Guyanese scholars, Walter Rodney, C.Y. Thomas, all of those scholars, and his name was also Hilary Beckles. I was named after him. So I have a long legacy in Guyana of persons with the same name, all connected, I presume. But here we are dealing with the British migration, and I, again, wish to confess that a part of this presentation is going to be semi-autobiographical because it touches upon a significant part of my own life. I was part of a migration. My parents migrated to England in 1958. I joined them in 1968. Typical circumstance. So I was 13 years old when I was taken from Barbados to Birmingham. So all of my teenage life was spent in the UK. I grew up there, and I returned home. I returned home at the age of 30. So that makes my family is a British family. My parents, my brothers, my sisters, all of my family are British, and that is their legal status. They are British citizens. I'm the only one in my family who's not a British citizen. And that is very significant because I chose not to be. And I could not accept the status of being British in the context of what I was experiencing as a teenager, as a young man in England. So I returned and turned around my identity and established my Barbadian citizenship in a formal sense. So some important personal decisions. So this is part, I will weave that into the narrative the best I can, while at the same time speaking about social theory, political theory, and the day-to-day living of the Barbadian people within the West Indian community, within the immigrant community, within Britain. So let's start at the beginning. A simple conceptual point that us humans are migratory, and we have been moving around for millions of years. And no one is where they were 50,000 years ago. We've all been moving from place to place. And this is the one enduring feature of humanity, that it moves, and it constantly moves. It's like the wind. It moves around the planet. And if you take a marker today, and you take a marker 500 years, 5,000, 50,000 years from now, you will see a different map, because we are all moving. If you consider, for example, that there are more African migrants to the US today, that is professional, middle-class African people who have immigrated to America, there are more of those than African Americans who are the descendants of enslaved people. So the recent African migrants have now outnumbered the descendants of the enslaved. And that changes when you speak of the black community. What does that mean? Well, there are two black communities. There's the Afro-American black community, and then there's the African migrant community. The former tends to vote Democrat, the latter tends to vote Republican. And all of that is very significant in terms of identity and immigration. Then we begin, I think, significantly with Barbados and what Barbados is. That first ship of non-indigenous people who arrived here in the 1620s, 1625, 27, and we have different dates, but 1625 for now. That ship with Englishmen and Africans, they found an empty island. Barbados was arguably the only empty island in the Caribbean at the moment of colonization. That makes Barbados unique. The first records we have of that, of the settlers writing back to the British King, Your Majesty, we have arrived at the island called Barbados, so named by the Portuguese. And guess what? There are no people on the island. Barbados is an empty island. But guess what, Your Majesty? There are houses everywhere. Now, that point alone is very significant. An empty island filled with houses. Indigenous villages scattered all over the place, but no people. Where are the people? Well, we know two things. We know that the Spanish will come into this island and raiding it for native people to take them to Mexico to work in the mines. We know the Portuguese were coming here to raid this island of the native people, to take them to Brazil to work on the sugar plantations. But what we do know that all of them had vanished. Those who survived ended up in the Windward Islands. They went to Dominica, especially St. Lucia, St. Vincent. That is where they reconstituted themselves with their own ethnic group and built up that community in the Windward Islands. So we have an empty island. So here we are now, one of the most migratory nations in the world, but starting that journey from an empty slate. The Africans who were brought here, we are going to be speaking about them and their descendants because these are mostly the people who went to the UK. But the English, or the Europeans, the British, I should say, who came here, because there were significant numbers of Irish and Scots who came here, were also migratory. And they too established this culture of migration. And in the 17th, 18th centuries, large migrations of the white people from this island to the USA. Mostly to the Carolinas, but we know that history. But first of all, to Jamaica. And it is not oftentimes recognized that the plan to capture Jamaica from the Spanish was organized here in Barbados. And the expedition that eventually led to the capturing of Jamaica departed from this island. And with it, thousands of white Barbadians went off to be a part of that capturing of Jamaica and the settlement of Jamaica and the ownership and development of Jamaica as a Barbadian diaspora. The English brought 600,000 Africans to this island. Now, if you digest that for a moment and you ask yourself, what is the population of Barbados today? And you say, well, it's probably 280, 90,000 people, mostly black people, 95% or so, descendants of the enslaved. But 600,000 were brought here. And the question, therefore, is, how do you reduce 600,000 people to 280,000 people? Or how do you reduce 600,000 people at emancipation, 1834, there are only 83,000 Africans. So you bring 600,000 onto the island, 200 years of slavery, and at the end of that 200 years of slavery, you have only 83,000, remaining less than a 20% survival rate. So the black people on this island are the descendants of a Holocaust. That is their first identity. They are the descendants of a Holocaust. They are the survivors, the 20% who survive of this massive importation. They are survivors. So we are looking, therefore, at a people who are possessed of a Holocaust consciousness. So with the emancipation, we have 83,000. And the first thing that happens is a massive migration out of the island. And there is a strategy by the plantation owners to hold on with clutches to that 83,000. Because that 83,000 is a survival of the economy, the plantation, the wealth of the elite. Hold on, and there are all kinds of anti-immigration strategies. So the first 50 years or so of emancipation, the white community is doing all it can to hold on to these 83,000 people. But the reason why they are struggling to do so is because the consciousness in the black community is largely to get out of here. This place is the source of the concept of chattel slavery. Barbados is the owner of chattel slavery. It started here. It was perfected here. It was exported from here to other places. This is the home of chattel slavery. And we have an important statement from the first generation of the enslaved people who are being interviewed by one itinerant priest traveling through this island. And the ex-slaves said to him that the slavery period, they refer to it in the families as the barbarity time. And the concept of slavery as the barbarity time is embedded in the black consciousness. So that in the 1930s, 100 years after emancipation, the oral history is showing that embedded in the black DNA are two memories deeply embedded. One, the barbarity time, which is that 200 years of slavery, and the cholera epidemic of 1854 that killed almost 20,000 people. And the memory of the cholera epidemic of 1854 that wiped out almost a quarter of the Barbadian people, the memory of that cholera epidemic and the memory of the barbarity time are the endemic memories in the consciousness. So all of this has political context, and we should speak to this context because this context is very important. Migration in Barbados is associated with vexation. Vexation because in the first generations after slavery, people are migrating in search of their families. This is the critical thing. The reconstitution of your family. The enslaved, as you know, were subject to diffusion. Slave owners would sell wives and children, daughters, brothers, sisters. Your families were sold across the region. It was a regional market for slave labor, and therefore selling children, wives, husbands, babies across the Caribbean is the norm. Emancipation comes, and the first thing you do, you go looking for your families. So thousands go to Jamaica. Thousands of Barbadians end up in Jamaica looking for their children, for their spouses, for their grandma, and so on. The same to Guyana, the same to the Leeward and Windward Islands. And of course, there's also a trickle into the US South because many of the enslaved Barbadians were sold into Virginia, Pennsylvania, and people go looking for their families. So the first wave of migration is family reconstitution. And it's powerful. It's a very powerful migration. Then we had the revolt and run migration. Many of the labor rebellions after emancipation were also associated with migration. Get out. It's oppressive, get out. Guyana, again, the Windward Islands, Jamaica, significant migration. Barbadians are finding all kinds of strategies to get out. And the reason they want to get out is very simple. Barbados is the only slave society, or the only plantation slave society, where the slave owners held on to all of their resources after emancipation. It's the only one. It's the only Caribbean island where the white elite, the plantocracy, who owned 95% of the land, it was the only place where that social class held on and survived emancipation intact. It's the only one. That is where we are going to build an alternate economy, where we can survive outside of these plantations in the valley. Those mountains is our new ecology. So that aggressive relationship of labor did not encourage the Jamaican poor in the 19th century to become too significantly migratory because they had access to an alternative body of land where they could build their villages, they could build their churches, they could develop their own African civilization, and the hills became the place of the reconstitution of the African peoples in Jamaica. To some extent, similarly in the Windward Islands. But in Barbados, no one moved. Fundamentally, structurally, what you actually had was you could jump from the frying pan into the fire, but back to the frying pan. But you moved from estate to estate, but conditions were virtually the same. The families who owned the plantation held on, so that at the end of the 19th century, 60 years after emancipation, maybe one person, one black person, owned a small sugar plantation out of 300. So, Barbados is unique. It's unique. And so, migration is associated with vexation. And then the big migration, the first big migration, Guyana was significant, but Panama, we know the Panama, and we will hear no doubt about the Guyana migration and the Panama migration. But the remarkable thing about the Panama migration was that it produced the first generation of calypsos. And one of my favorite calypsos of that period was "Hit the overseer on his head and come with we." In other words, before you get on the boat, and the careenage, and head off to Panama, do something radical. Don't just get on the boat. Make a statement. Give the overseer on the plantation a lick on his head, and then jump on the boat. So the migration is associated with a politics. There is politics embedded in migration. You cannot understand migration out of this island significantly without understanding the politics of the time. And so we come to the 1930s when we are now seeing migration as a top priority in colonial politics. The people of Barbados, led by Clement Payne, have engaged in a revolutionary action. If you listen carefully to the speeches given by Clement Payne, he's talking about slum clearance in Bridgetown. 100 years later, the people are living in these slums. He's talking about land redistribution. How are you going to keep now maybe 90,000 people, and they are landless? The Barbadian black people are the most landless black people in the Caribbean. Everywhere else in the Caribbean, there have been some kind of redistribution, reform, some frontier, the hills, some forest where you go, some place you can go and get land and start again. It's the only place where the black community, by and large, 95% are landless. And again, this is a unique feature of the Barbadian people, and of course, that is the history of the Chattel House. You don't like the conditions on my plantation? Well, take up your hut and go and look for job or work somewhere else. So you take up your little house and you move, looking for a better wage. So the workers on this island, in alliance with the progressive middle class, organize the anti-colonial rebellion and bring this colony to its knees. The same takes place across the Caribbean, as you know. It's a Caribbean revolution. It's the first time that all the black people in all the Caribbean at the same time are doing the same thing. It's the first time in our history that the black people in every island at the same time, 34, 35, 36, 30, Barbados 30, Jamaica 38, island by island by island by island, the revolution is spreading. What do they want? They want land, they want economic development, they want modernization, and they want an end to colonialism. This is very important because when the British government sent the Moyne Royal Commission to the Caribbean to investigate what is going on in the Caribbean, that all of our colonies are going up in arms, get to the root of it. At the root of it was that sense of closure, of being imprisoned on these islands with little scope of development. And not surprisingly, the Moyne Commission was faced with the choice. We either recommend emigration off this island, or we do something about the redistribution of wealth. And the conversation was placed very bluntly before the British government. Very blunt. You either, if you want to hold on to colonization, if you want to keep a grip on these islands, you have to release the labor force. Because that labor force is also political revolutionary material. And so The conversation took place in the British Parliament. What is to be done about the West Indies? If we don't release the labor, if we don't create opportunities for labor to move out of these islands, we're going to have another round of rebellion. And so the emigration that we're speaking about tonight was the result of a political calculation made by the British government that it was in the interest of the empire and to perpetuate colonization by allowing the workers, the poor, to come to England. It all worked out brilliantly for Britain because they had just fought, they'd fought a war. At the end of the war, Britain was significantly bombed out by Nazi aircraft. And one of the ironies is, of course, is that there were many West Indians, Barbadians, who went to fight in that war. So understand this predicament. You have revolted against the British in Barbados. Then you go to England to join the war to defend Britain, okay? Now, that might seem a contradictory, anomalous kind of thinking, but if you read some of the narratives of West Indians who went to England to fight in the war, I mean, one of our colleagues gave a brilliant narrative a few weeks ago. He said, I went to England to join the war. I was a gunner. I bombed many German towns. I bombed many German soldiers. I bombed many German villages and farms. But to this day, I've never met a German. I've never seen one. But the good thing about that, was he said, was that since I did not see them, they did not see me. And so he survived it. But having survived it, he said, I didn't go to fight to defend no empire. What nonsense is that? I went to get an opportunity to get an education. Because part of the British strategy was if you fight in the war, when the war is over, you get a grant to go and study. And so after 4 years of this war, he survived and he got a university education. Wouldn't have gotten that if he had stayed here. So there are some interesting contradictory moments. So Britain needs to be cleaned up. It's a mess. And I can tell you that when I went to England in the late 60s to live, you could still see elements of the German bombing, buildings bombed out, streets still bombed. You could still see some of that. But that was 20 years after the war. And the 20 years after the war, the West Indians, the Barbadians, were a very large part of that cleanup army. So that the 27,000 Barbadians who migrated to England between the end of the war and the early 70s, that 27,000 migration, which was the largest single migration since the Panama migration, which was somewhere between 40,000, 45,000 people. This British migration was in the area of 27,000. My parents were part of that 27,000. And they're the ones who did the cleanup job. Clean up the streets, clean up the buildings. And now there's a labor shortage. Who's going to drive the buses? Who's going to take care of the hospitals? Who's going to do all of the work with transportation and health services? And 500,000 West Indians, thank you, 500,000 West Indians are assembled to come to England to clean up the mess. And that mess they were cleaning up in England is the other side of the mess that Clement Payne said they should clean up in Barbados. And Clement Payne did say the British should come to this island where they built slavery, where they colonized the people. Look at the mess in Bridgetown. It's the worst slum in the Caribbean. And by the way, the Moyne Commission report that investigated the 30s did report that the Bridgetown slums were the worst slums in the West Indies. Of all their colonies, the Bridgetown slums were the worst. In fact, they concluded that the material conditions of the working class poor in Barbados were the worst in the West Indies. So there's a reason for that. As I said, this is where slavery started in a big way, and now this is where the legacies are most visible. And so the Moyne Commission made that conclusion, but we didn't need the Moyne Commission to make that conclusion because Lloyd George, the former Prime Minister 20 years earlier, did say that the Caribbean or the West Indies are an embarrassment to the British good name, and most of all, the place called Barbados, because of the Bridgetown slums. So against that background, 27,000 folks moved into Britain to begin this cleaning up mess. One of the ideologies that was turned over by this migration was the ideology that black people are lazy. That was an ideology that was embedded in British social theory about Caribbean folks. Because after emancipation, they came to realize that the black folks were not keen to work. Now, analyze this. If you enslave 600,000 people on an island over time, and then you abolish slavery, why would there be this enthusiasm to work? The first thing you would imagine is that it's time to have a breather. The first thing you would expect from the people is we need 10 years to chill. I mean, that's the first reaction you should expect, that the people would say, oh my God, after 200 years of this, we need 20 years to relax, fet, party, chill out, sleep on the beach, eat mangoes under the coconut tree. We need to chill. But in the effort to chill, the ideological argument was these people are lazy. They are good for nothing. And if you read the language from British press, British intellectuals, British travelers, there is this constant description of lazy black people, lazy black people. And it goes all the way through the 19th century. These lazy people, all they want to do is eat pumpkins and lie around under the coconut tree. 19th century British literature is filled with that language. But these are the people who you are now going to bring to England to put your economy back on its feet. The trains must now run on time again. The train must leave the station and get to the next destination on time. Now, who's going to do that? The West Indian train drivers. The buses must leave the station and get to the end of the line on time. And when you go to a bus stop, you look at the bus stop and you say, my bus is due here at 9:10. And you know that bus is going to be there at 9:10. Who's driving that bus? The West Indians. Now, so how suddenly a bunch of lazy people in the colonies are going to be the most efficient, the most productive, the most scientific bunch of workers at the heart of Western industrial culture, the West Indians. And that was a reputation that the Barbadians developed, a reputation for hard work, for efficiency, and all of that. Now, the historian in me would immediately classify that 27,000 migration in its historical context. This is the second round of the Middle Passage. Okay. 600,000 brought from Africa to this island, where they dwell for 200 years, and now they are needed elsewhere again for cheap labor or free labor. They are needed elsewhere, and then you organize them and ship them back across the Atlantic to another place to do work. So it's the second leg of the Middle Passage, and that is how it must be seen. Because when we were needed on the sugar estates, we were brought. Now we are needed in the factories of Britain, and we've moved again. And the question is, where are you going to be moved to next? That is how, as historians, we look at this back across the Atlantic once again, folks. We are needed to do some industrial work. The first time we were needed for agriculture, and now we are needed for industry, back on the boat, back across the Atlantic. Now, the theories that have been developed by the sociologists and the anthropologists to explain all of this are many and diverse. I am going to say something about that very quickly because the dominant theory to explain all of this is the overpopulation theory. Barbados is the only island in this Caribbean world that is definitely overpopulated. And therefore, overpopulation is driving migration. Open the valves, let the pressure out, let a quarter of them disappear across the world. But overpopulation is a function of the distribution of wealth. Overpopulation does not stand in and of itself. You are overpopulated only because the wealth and the resources are owned by a small minority, and therefore everyone else is surplus. Everyone else is surplus, given the tightness of ownership. So overpopulation is a relative issue that speaks to the maldistribution of wealth. So basically what you're saying is, in the overpopulation theory, is that it has the largest number of landless people. It has the largest number of financially marginalized people. It has the largest proportion of persons living in the margins of the economy. That is really what overpopulation theories are all about. Because you can change that overnight. You can change that thesis overnight. Redistribute some issues, and suddenly you have a labor shortage. And we all know that that is what Barbados needs. There are too few people on this island. There are, in fact, too few people on this island. If we really want to have a genuinely sustainable economy, there are too few people. We don't have enough consumers on the island to allow businesses to invest in mass production so that there's a domestic market to consume the goods. The domestic market to consume the goods, you pay taxes, the government gets more taxation out of larger consumer base. You need to put pressure on the housing market, redistribute housing. What is wrong with a town in Belle Plaine? A town that sits crossroads, a significant town, redistribute the population, create new industries, restructure the economy. So these are all solutions that can be derived from a circumstance. Look at what Antigua did. Antigua, we all know, is the only island in the Caribbean where the native-born Antiguans are a minority. And native-born Antiguans are a minority in their own island because the decision was taken that 50,000 people is not enough to develop the economy. We need 100,000 people. And therefore they opened the doors, 10,000 Jamaicans, 8,000 Guyanese, 4,000 Haitians, and you double the population. And now you have a domestic market, you have an economy that can now be stimulated and predicted, which is very smart. The importance of that is that 15 years from now, the children of those immigrants are going to be locally born. So for 10 years, non-locals are the majority, but 20 years later, all of their children are Antiguan born. So it is only a window of time. Then there's the thesis, why did these Barbadians go to England? Beyond the demographic thesis about being overpopulated, which is not, as I said, is not accurate, there is the cultural identity argument. And this argument is very attractive because it is built into this mythology about Little England. And therefore, the black people in Barbados were socialized historically through institutional power, through education, through the church, to believe somehow that this is Little England. Well, I don't know. I have never been able to understand that concept, this little England thing. What is this based upon? But it was a socialization where the majority of the African people were socialized into believing that you are English. You're not Yoruba. You're not Mandingo, Fulani. You're not Ga. You are English. And therefore, if I migrate to England, I'm going home. I have a right to go home. England is my home because this is Little England, and all I want to do is leave Little England and go to Big England. And the journey from Little England to Big England is not an external journey, it's a domestic journey on the same cultural terrain. And so when I moved from Barbados to Birmingham, that was meant to be a walk down the street. I was just leaving little Barbados and going to Big England, and I'm just walking across the street. It's a cultural movement. It's a domestic. It is not an international journey. And to some extent, this was correct. Because when I arrived in Birmingham and I looked around, all the names of all the big people were all the names of all the big people back home. And then you dig a bit deeper, do some research, and find out that the same people in Birmingham who have monuments and statues and buildings are the same people who had monuments in Barbados and plantations and so on. So yes, it was an internal journey. You know, George Lamond tells the story of this Barbadian who arrived in 53. 53 was the year that Queen Elizabeth was coronated, I believe, 53. And he arrives in England and sees the coronation celebrations in London, the decorations, the bugles, the fanfare of the young queen being coronated. And he writes home to his mum and said, "Dear mum, you'll be happy to know that I have arrived here safely. And guess what? They are celebrating it here as well." Now, the remarkable thing about that is that quite accurately, this young man, having left the celebration, the whole of Barbados is decorated because a young queen, an imperial queen, whose ancestors had enslaved us. An imperial queen who in 1966 was at the Bell Plantation because she was having a dinner with her first cousin, the Duke of Harewood, on his plantation that his family had owned since the end of the 18th century. A slavocracy as a monarchy. So here we are in Barbados celebrating a monarchy that was a slavocracy. A woman whose ancestors built the first multinational conglomerate for slave trading, the Royal African Company, the biggest slave trading company in the world. The biggest slave trading company in the world, built by the royal family. The Duke of York is the chairman of the board of directors. And that is a company with a mandate to bring 4,000 Africans across the Atlantic every year, 2,000 to Barbados per year. But she's on her first cousin's sugar plantation having a banquet. And that was the biggest plantation owned by the family and had owned it for 200 years. So the history comes full circle. So our Barbadian man who writes home to his mother had every reason to say, guess what? Guess what, Mum? They are celebrating it here as well. Because he didn't expect that. He thought he was in England. He thought he was in Great Britain when, in fact, he was in Little England. But importantly, the empire was established to give the black folks in Barbados citizenship because you were part of the British Empire. And therefore, when you arrive in England, you arrive as a British citizen. when my parents went to England, they had a passport, Great Britain and Empire written on it. And they arrived in England as British citizens because they were from the British Empire. And therefore, their identity as British citizens was consistent with their belief, to some extent, that they were not going to a foreign place. They were not going to a foreign place. They were going home. Now, clearly they would have recognized that the way in which they were organized to go home was consistent with an earlier migration. There were recruitment agents going from village to village. The recruitment agents for the British railway industry. The recruitment officers for the hospitals. The recruitment for the public services in the inner cities. Companies and the agents arrived in Barbados, went from village to village, urging people to immigrate, writing them up. Give us your name, your age. Let us examine you. You're healthy, you're young, you're fit. Come, there's work for you to do. Then there is the thesis about in search of economic benefit. Yes, that was very significant indeed as a source of motive. Migration in search of benefit. Wage levels in Barbados were arguably the lowest wages in the region. But my colleagues who have worked on the 19th century would also know that the wage levels in Barbados were also the lowest after emancipation. That the former enslaved in Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana, and so on were getting twice as much for a day's work as they were getting in Barbados. So Barbados, therefore, had the lowest wage levels of the working class across the region. And we can quantify that. So here are people then with the lowest net wage value in the region, given an opportunity to go home to Great Britain to increase and improve their material well-being. And they took it. And in most instances, as was the case with the Panama, the 45,000 who went to Panama, they were young people. Young people, gendered, largely male, mostly unmarried men that change the fertility levels on this island considerably. And the reason why that is significant is also because Barbados, again, another unique feature of this island. Barbados was the only island in the Caribbean during slavery and after where women outnumbered men. Women outnumbered men on this island from the 1720s. From as early as the 1720s, women had outnumbered men, and this has been a female majority island ever since, and that's a unique feature. So, with a significantly male migration, it shifts even more the fertility levels on this island. That, of course, suppressed the birth rate, and the population from the 1970s and 80s began to dip, and that is where it continues to dip now. It probably has the lowest fertility in the region right now. I haven't seen the data on fertility, but I wouldn't be surprised if the Barbados net birth rate is the lowest in the region. But these Barbadians arrive in Britain into a political ecosystem dominated by Enoch Powell and the right-wing racist ideologue who felt that British society was being diminished by the significant presence of these black people. And Enoch Powell was arguably the most popular, not necessarily the most loved, but the most popular of British parliamentarians. Everyone knew the name Enoch Powell. This was a man who said, if we don't get these black people out of here, this blood is going to run in the streets of England. And the rivers of blood thesis, the rivers of blood argument, was played over and over and over on the BBC, and many of us would listen to this rivers of blood argument. Now, then began the process of de-skilling. There is now a growing proportion of detailed empirical research, which we've never had before, showing that what actually happened was that a significant proportion of the workers who left this island were skilled workers. There were skilled workers in many crafts, many professions, male and female. And these, historically, are usually the people who are first to migrate. It's always people with a skill who believe their skill is a passport. Their skill can be the basis of an accumulation. The skill gives confidence. The skill gives courage. And the notion of being a skilled person gives you dignity. Agricultural people tend to be, or non-skilled agricultural people tend to be more reticent. So, use skilled migration. Arrived in England and are asked to do unskilled work. So, massive skilled migration, forced now to do unskilled work. And many of those bus drivers and so on were people who had left this island with technical skills. And it's important because in my own household, I saw this. In my own household, I saw this. When my father left this island, he was 32 years old. He was a master tailor, having spent 5 years as an apprentice tailor to become a master tailor. He's a master tailor, has his little shop in St. Andrew, Beckles, master tailor. You know, this is a very big thing, you know. For a young man in the 40s to have his tailor shop with his master tailor name up there, and people will come and get, ladies and gentlemen will come and get measured and everything. There's a wedding, he's going to outfit the groom, he's going to outfit the bride, and this is a big thing. Skill. Goes to the UK, went to every tailoring store, factory, cannot be employed as a tailor because the unions in Britain are saying you cannot bring those West Indians into this country to do skill work. The unions will not have it. And so in the factories where skill work was being done, West Indians could not do that work because there was a union blockade. And there would have been industrial dispute if the skilled West Indian labor force was inducted into the skilled professions of the industries. And so he would go to Burton's and he would say, here's my city and guild certificate. I'm a master tailor and I would like to pursue my profession. See that door? Go through that door. Thousands of Barbadians were de-skilled by that migration. And de-skilling is significant because the skill wage level was significantly higher than the unskilled manual labor in the British industrial sector. And therefore, if you went to the bottom of the labor force with the lowest wage levels, your chances of getting a mortgage to have your own home, zil. Your chances of going to a bank or an insurance company to borrow, to get a loan, zilch. So understand the significance of de-skilling. The significance of de-skilling is that you impoverish those people, kept them into an intergenerational impoverishment because your salary levels kept you out of the mainstream of the financial sector. And therefore, West Indians, Barbadian workers on the whole, were not in a position to engage the banks and the insurance companies for mortgages, for loans, and so on. That was the implication. The unskilled labor was meant to keep you in a situation of poverty, impoverishment. That's one aspect. The second aspect of that was the deschooling of the children. Understand that. The deschooling of the children. So understand it's an intergenerational. The parents are de-skilled, not allowed to practice their craft, bottom of the labor force. And the children who had experienced solid secondary education on this island, on arrival, were placed into vocational schools because there was no policy in the Birmingham, London local educational authority to test the children and allocate them to a school appropriately. So I arrived from Coleridge in Paris, 3.5, 4 years of secondary education. Loving all the mathematics and the Latin, and up to our neck in Latin, loved it. And all the classical education we got in the old Barbados grammar school. Arrived in the UK, not knowing anything, and like hundreds of other children, thrown into an industrial vocational school, where we did woodwork and metalwork every day. Now, so we're in these vocational schools, and we are clustered as West Indian children. And most of us, our parents are working class people. Our parents don't know how to go to the mayor. Our parents don't know how to go to the educational authorities and say, this is not right. Our parents were just poor people who were happy to know that their children are in school. They had no idea what kind of school, what type of school, what they were doing. Most people didn't know that. And thus, I entered that situation and saw hundreds of West Indian children, who could not hold their own because the educational system was horrendously racist. The teachers, the pedagogy, it was an awful time. And as you know, there was a famous book written by Bernard Cord, How the British Educational System has rendered West Indian children educationally subnormal. That was the norm. They were classified as educationally subnormal, thrown into vocational schools, and abandoned with parents who didn't understand. Now, in my own instance, I think, grace of God, I had a bigger brother who was in the States and came over to England and said, what is this? And took me out of that school, dragged me by my ears out of that school, and put me in a community college, an adult community college, where I could go and do O-levels and A-levels and recover. But I can tell you, those of us who recovered from that experience were probably 1% who recovered from that industrial school experience of the children. But I can also tell you something about that, which is very important. And I'm coming to closure. In my school, there was a young boy from Jamaica who had no secondary education. He attended one of those, what you call the all-age primary schools. So he's 13, had no secondary background. All-age primary school. But could not do the basic social science or whatever, mathematics and so on. But one day, he came to my home, and my father, who had given me a guitar for my birthday, because my father was also a self-taught musician, could play the piano, could play the guitar, self-taught musician. He gave me this guitar. I am totally tone deaf. There is no way I could understand that fretboard. I mean, it's like a foreign language. There's no way I could do that. But my friend picked up that guitar, and anything he heard, he could play. And I couldn't figure out how my brethren just could play this instrument, and within 2 years, he was the founder of a reggae band. 6 years later, he's playing with steel pulps. And now he's a multi-millionaire living in California. That was an important lesson. Every child has a gift, and hopefully that child will always have the chance to explore that gift. And I learned that in a vocational school. So, moving along then to this reality. The families were the basis of this migration. Father would go in the migration process. Wife would follow. Children would follow. And that was the model of the migration to Britain. So Britain then became a place where the family, again, was reconstituted. And this is the commitment of the Barbadian people to family as an important institution. So after slavery, they went looking for their family. Now we're in Britain, we're bringing the family back together into the unit. And this is very important, this family structure issue, because then the families were having a first generation of British-born children. Now, when I arrived in England, my parents had already had 2 kids born in England. I mean, one of the issues in our family, we make a joke about it. My father was there for like 4 years by himself, and then he sent for Mom, and as soon as she arrived, bam, baby. Now, so 2 young Beckleses are born there. 4 Bajan Beckleses are brought over. So 6, 2 local, 2 indigenous, and 2 foreign. Understand that is a very tricky household. A very tricky household to understand how immigration works, because that rice and peas and thing, those British-born children not eating that. And so my poor mother had to cook 1 meal for her Bajan children and another meal for her English children. And that becomes a serious cultural, sociological identity rift right there. And guess what? 10 years later, West Indies come to England to play cricket. Viv Richards, Clive Lloyd. The Bajan children are supporting the West Indies. The English-born children supporting England. So Viv Richards is, as people say, Viv Richards beating ball. And these British Beckleses are vexed, sitting in the corner, face chupsing, because they're supporting Botham and Goa. And so we have a rift, a serious cultural rift between expectation, because they are British, they are England, England is their home, and the English cricket team is their team. And if you Bajans don't like it, go back where you want to come from. Understand that conversation takes place in the family, the cultural differentiation. But the final point I wish to make about this is the second leg of the migration. It did not take the Barbadians long enough to realize that Britain was a low-wage, low-accumulation economy. And within 20 years, about 30% of those Bajans who had gone to England had made the comparative analysis through information and realized that US and Canada were higher wage economies. You could accumulate more, you could advance yourself more, and another migration started out of the UK. And so, in my family, the 15 of us who were now in England, 12 adults packed up, moved to the US, and moved to Canada, creating a discourse. Which families did best? Those who lived in England, those who changed directions, went to the US, and those who moved on further and went to Canada. The evidence was clear, absolutely clear, those who stayed in England were the poorest in the families. And those who went to Canada had the highest level of accumulation, followed by those who went to the US. So we actually had families where 3 brothers, one brother goes to Canada, one goes to the US, one stays in England. They're both all doing the same kind of work, but the wage levels were higher, the accumulation levels were higher, and what we found was that the returning residents, the ones who came back and built their big houses in Barbados, the first groups of them who started that were the ones who went to Canada and the ones who went to the US. The Brits were the last. And that is a very important point. Of course, you can see the results. If you look at the US, there is no British equivalent to Eric Holder. There's no British equivalent to Shirley Chisholm, who leaves this country, parents leaves this country, first generation, and she's a presidential candidate, the first black presidential candidate. You don't have that in England. We are now having that in England for the first time after 80 years. We're now having the 4th generation migrants going into parliament and taking senior positions in the state. But that became the norm in the US in the 2nd generation, and of course later on in Canada. So the Bajans tried to differentiate themselves. The Bajans were only 8% of the West Indian population. The Jamaicans were about 60% of the West Indians, followed by the Guyanese. The Bajans were 3rd. So the Bajans were a small group within a large migration. 500,000 West Indians, 27,000 Bajans. But the identity of the Barbadian was the identity that was based around conservative accumulation, steady as you go. The Jamaican migrant mentality was fundamentally different. It demanded more space. It protected itself from racism. When gangs came into our community to destroy our community, it was the Jamaicans who mobilized themselves to resist and protect our communities. The Barbadians didn't have that sense of political radical aggression to say no. Our tendency was fundamentally to go to church and ask for God's guidance. And that was the stereotypical response. So it was the discovery of West Indianness that brought us together, because gradually they came to realize they could not separate themselves, that they were West Indians and they had a West Indian identity. And eventually they forged that bond of West Indianness. So by the time I was packing up to leave there, and I was packing up to leave on a one-way ticket, the West Indians had then forged an identity as one people. And we could see that being expressed. So they arrived there as Barbadians and as Jamaicans. But within 10 to 15 years, they had forged a West Indian identity, which was palpable. And we saw it in community organization, we saw it in the church, we saw it in cricket, we saw it in all the activities. We discovered our West Indianness in Britain. And that was the great discovery, I think, of this migration. It wasn't the discovery of Great Britain from Little England. It wasn't the discovery of our peculiar identity and history. We discovered that we were West Indian people, one common history, one common destiny, and a willingness to stand up for the West Indies as one place. And that found expression in the language of Frank Worrell. It found expression in George Lamin and Kamau Brathwaite. It found expression in all of our intellectual traditions and legacy that we have found our West Indianness. And in that regard, I wish to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity. to speak about history, biography, sociology, and politics. And allow me to say that the story and the journey is not yet complete. The Barbadians and Britain and the next generation are going to do some magnificent things in their West Indianness. And sooner or later, you're going to be hearing many more things about great West Indians who are descendants from this island home of ours. Thank you very much.
So that was simply brilliant. I think the Vice Chancellor deserves another round of applause. Yes, so we're now going to go into our question and answer session. So members of the audience who wish to ask questions, you can stand and do so. We encourage you to keep your questions brief. We've had a brilliant lecture, so we want to avoid the tendency to have mini lectures. And we would like, as far as possible, that we have questions. So the floor is open. There's a microphone coming around for anyone who just raise your hand and we got a microphone to you. You were so good, no questions. Okay, I see a hand here. Come.
Professor Beckles, I have a question which has been on my mind for a while, and it relates to the comparison, or if we are learning from our history in the past. Right now, which you mentioned it, the low birth rate in England, and we also have the low birth rate in Barbados. Also, there's a low birth rate in Canada right now. And Canada is looking for skilled immigrants right now. And in my opinion, there seems to be a void in Barbados with regards to the government helping Barbadians, qualified, unqualified, unemployed, who want to go to Canada to work as skilled immigrants. Recently, there was a scammer that came into Barbados. He set up an association. He said he was going to help Barbadians find jobs in Canada. He made them pay up $150 to join the association, and then another set of money to get a permit to go to Canada. About 300 Barbadians. This happened within the last 6 months. And none of those Barbadians were able to get a job through his association in Canada. And it puzzled me because our
Well, let me say this.
my opinion, I don't think
Well,
they're doing a good job.
let's take that from the other side. If you compare and contrast the three categories of migration, UK, US, Canada, the UK migration was largely from the skilled working class. The US migration was largely from the lower middle class and middle class, people already with resources. The Canadian migration of the last 30 years has been the educated professional group, so that the Canadian migration can be justly classified as a brain drain. Okay. And to the extent that it is a brain drain, in a nation that needs its professional skills to stay at home and build the nation, the migration to Canada is largely subversive of national development. You can very well say two things. On the other hand, you could say, but they send home remittances, and these remittances are adding to the foreign exchange earnings of the country. We know that argument, and there is truth in that argument. There's an argument that says it gives young people an opportunity to acquire internationally competitive skills that they would not have had the opportunity to do so at home, which is more restricted. You can make that point, and again, there's evidence to support that. But if you put those two arguments together and you net them off, the net value contribution of those people on this island will be much greater than the remittances that they send back. But the country is faced with the traditional predicament which I described. If you work on the assumption that your country is overpopulated, and therefore every 10 years you have to get rid of 20% of them or 10% of them to maintain stability, if you work on that assumption, you have gone into an economic development cul-de-sac. Because, as I said, all of the countries that have had substantial sustainable development and growth in recent years are countries that treasure their large population, restructure their economies, reorganize their wealth distribution, create educational opportunities for people to practice business into the economy as owners of wealth. You have to go through the economic enfranchisement path to give these masses of people a chance to build their country and empower themselves. If you don't take that path, if you continue with the belief that a small percentage of the people who controls the majority of the wealth will always achieve economic growth, that this small minority would take the country forward. They are the ones with the knowledge and the business skills. They are the ones who are going to transform the country. All the countries that have grown in the last 20, 30 years have shown that the growth has come from the middle and the growth has come from the bottom. The big corporations, the big owners, their net contribution does not compare with the million people, the thousands of small businesses and medium-sized businesses. This is where the growth comes from. And we are persisting in Barbados with a model of minority wealth ownership, leading to the conclusion that the island is overpopulated. It has a surplus population, and therefore migration is a solution to stability. It is a fallacious argument. It is tempting, but we have to get rid of it. And that is the only way we're going to get what we're looking for. Otherwise, you will always have these scammers because they are aware that the people of this island are vulnerable. They have had hundreds of years of being told that they must move out in order to survive. And with that culture embedded in your society, you're always going to be vulnerable to people who dangle in front of you an immigration prospect. What they should be dangling in front of you is a transformation prospect with economic enfranchisement, the reform of the economy, legislation to spread the wealth and to spread opportunity. That is the future. That is the only future. Immigration is not the future of this island.
Thank you so much, Professor Beckles. Do we have any information about current migration in terms of graduates from the University of the West Indies at this moment? Because my understanding was that we were maybe got like 70% of tertiary educated people leaving Barbados and the Caribbean. I'm just curious if that's true or if we know.
Well, I am not sure if the figure is as high as that, but I know it is approaching that. I know that we are not retaining 70% of our graduates. I think we are losing maybe 20, 30%, maybe in some islands even more. But we are losing far too many. And it is, one can argue, it is a chicken and egg argument. You educate people to build a country. You educate them to have the mentality that says we are going to dig in and transform our country. But it is tempting to emigrate because industry has not created the diversity of employment prospects to absorb them. So we have a problem that our economies are not sufficiently diverse, sufficiently dynamic, sufficiently democratic to absorb the creativity of these young people who are keen to make their way in the world. And if they're not given the chance, they will emigrate. So where do we begin? Do we begin by restructuring the state, using whatever instruments available to it to restructure, to insist upon it? Do we incentivize traditional business people? Because the fact is that most of the businesses in the region are not sufficiently dynamic because they are mostly either in the commercial trade dimension. The international business sector is very dominant in the financial commercial sector. And maybe there isn't enough room for indigenous creativity. But we do have a systemic problem, but it has to be addressed. And I believe that the states, the governments have a responsibility to address it. Because if you're funding education and the net benefits of that education are not accruing domestically, then there are systemic problems. We have to confront the systemic problems and deal with them because we cannot afford to be losing our best, youngest minds. We speak about this quite often in our university. We have engaged the private sector across the region in this conversation. We're having this conversation. We are saying, you have to realize that you have this pool of skills coming out of the institution. One of the responses to them is they say to us, your graduates are not skills ready. Now, let's say that is hyperbole a little bit, because you cannot say that our doctors who come out of the medical school are not skills ready because they're out of school, they're doing surgeries the next day. You cannot say that our students who are doing economics and finance and tourism are not skills ready because they come out and they're running institutions. But the solution has to be a corporate class that says, we are going to take that graduate out of university that has just received 4 to 5 years of university education, and we're going to give you some specific on-the-job training to turn you into the resource that we want. In other words, they have a duty to do it. The university does not have a complete and total duty to make every graduate factory ready. There has to be a partnership between the employer class and the university, a partnership that says, you give us that 80% graduate and we're going to turn it into 100% with internal orientation and specific training. That is the model in most developed countries. Or better still, while they are students, develop an internship culture where they come into the factories, into the offices, 6 months, 3 months, and when they graduate, there are so many possibilities. But it is unreasonable to say that they're not ready. And I will give you finally an example of that. We had a case in Trinidad a few years ago where student, graduate, engineering graduate went to work in a factory. Generator broke down. Manager says, okay, you UB graduate, BEng, Bachelor of Education, fix a generator. And the guy is just on the job 3 weeks, and he says, Where is it? Where's the generator? Now, the manager said, you see that thing there? That thing is the generator. He said, okay, no problem. Got out his stuff, goes in, unscrews it, in 2 minutes, power's back up. In other words, he knew the science of the generator, but he had never had an internship. And the fancy machine, he didn't recognize it. But once the door was open, he knew the science that was inside because he was taught the science on the inside. And in 2 minutes, he fixed it after he recognized it. And that is a classic example of what can happen if you don't give students internships. Because if he had his internship, the conversation would not have existed because he would have gone straight to it and did what he had to do.
Good evening, Professor Beckles. To what extent do you think the growth of today's digital economy is shifting or changing the dynamic with respect to immigration when we look at it in the traditional construct? I'm saying that because we hear today the world is flat, and we know that we are more or less teaching our young people coming out of university and otherwise to see the world as that space where they can engage. It doesn't matter where you live. You can work in Timbuktu, you can work in Africa, from right here in Barbados. So perhaps the need to emigrate will change as time goes on. How do we shift the conversation so that we are not so much concerned with emigration and perhaps stopping it, but we are more concerned with pushing our young people towards seeing themselves as global citizens and grasping the opportunities that the growth in the digital economy is presenting?
I appreciate the question because it gets to the heart of the matter. There's a fundamental difference between being a globally engaged knowledge worker where your intellect has been partnered in multiple jurisdictions simultaneously and you're part of that global value added. There's a difference between that and being a citizen of a country in which you are told we are overpopulated and we need to get rid of 20,000 people in the next 5 years. And that we need to get you out because you're putting pressure on domestic resources, you need to go. There are two very different questions, and what you have just described is the new frontier. However, I would add to that the notion that globalization is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it speaks to global mobility, global access, all of that global level playing field stuff. By the way, I have never seen a level playing field, have you? Okay. But there's all that stuff there about level playing fields, globalization, and so on. But if you examine globalization very, very carefully, granularly on the ground, you will find that the nation state, despite the digital globalization, the nation state remains the building block of the global economy. The nation state is the fundamental organizing unit of globalization. So the conflict in the global economy is really about strong economies versus weak economies, strong nation states versus weak nation states. But nation state it is. Why do you think Britain Brexited? It's a nation state. A globalized nation state says, however, we are economically globalized. We are part of the global world. But guess what? This is a nation state. And the most important feature of our identity is our nationhood. Now, from our foundation of nationhood, we will be digitally and globally engaged, but don't interfere with our sovereignty. And Britain felt that its sovereignty was being unnecessarily undermined. And they retreated to protect their sovereignty as a nation in the context of their desire to be global. And that is the ambivalence there. So yes, at the end of this, we still have to ask a question. Is the role of the citizen let us say us in the Caribbean, is our role as citizens to strengthen our Caribbean nation, to strengthen the footing of our Caribbean nation state? Or are we to say that our citizenship is global and fluid and borderless and boundaryless, and we can be anywhere, with no overarching commitment to space? I think the Brexit have taught some people some important lessons. I think Trump has taught some people important lessons. America first taught them some very important lessons. The nation state in the digital global era that calls for that borderlessness, the building block of it is still the nation state. And we ought to have our fundamental commitment to Caribbean identity, Caribbean nation. That's where we should start. So if from that base we do all of these fantastic global things, wonderful. But don't...
That seems desirable, but I think globalization is going to work at deconstructing that. I think that's where it's headed.
Deconstructing nationhood? Well, it has been trying for the last 40, 50 years. In fact, it is being reversed at the moment. And the tide is going the other way. More and more countries are retreating and pulling their sovereignty away from it and saying, no, our sovereignty should not be a part of this. We need to be members of a state with a defined culture and identity, and from that base, we will participate globally. I think the trend is going the other way, in fact. Many people thought that the nation state was going to disappear. The literature of the 70s, 80s, 90s said, this is the end of the nation. This is the end of nationhood. This is globalization. This is world citizenship. It's working the other way. It's going back the other way. So I'll put my money, I'll put my money on more reversals. Okay.
Hi, good night. So my question is there a specific reason why you kept saying West Indian instead of Caribbean? And
Okay.
if there is, why?
Bad habit. Bad habit. West Indian, this notion of islands. And it's a concept that we tend to use in the English-speaking islands. When we say Caribbean, we include then all the islands and all the countries that have a Caribbean coast. So when I say Caribbean, I tend to mean Colombia, Panama, Costa Rica, all the way through Colombia, all the way through Guyana, Suriname, and then I come up through the islands, and I might even include Mexico because they have a Caribbean coast. So I tend to use the word Caribbean when I'm referring to the 300 million people, the 300 million people that exist around the Caribbean Sea and use the Caribbean Sea as part of their identity. That's a lot of people. It is more than the US, you know. If you take all the Caribbean peoples who are part of the Caribbean Sea, 300 million people. But when I say West Indies, I tend to speak of those of us in the archipelago who were part of that British colonial experience. I hope that helps it, but we have that problem to deal with, though. We have to sort it out.
Hi, good evening, Sir Hilary.
Good evening.
Hi. I had a question. My interest was sparked when you mentioned the contrast between...
Sir, sorry. Oh, sorry, I didn't see you.
Hi. You mentioned the contrast between how Jamaicans kind of rallied and, you know, they fought against gang culture and they seemed a little less passive. But then you mentioned that Barbadians were a little quieter and they kind of believed in church and God and they had a different approach to what they saw as someone encroaching on them. Could you give us some insight into why you think that might be? Like what might be the political or social or psychological origins of that?
It's an interesting predicament, and I did say that these were stereotypical conceptions. In other words, it's hard to prove it scientifically. It is a perception that it seemed to be the case, but you haven't tested it mathematically. Now, but if you were to test it mathematically, you would probably come to the conclusion that in the countries like Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, the larger Caribbean societies that presented the African people with an alternate approach to existence had a more developed political consciousness in the area of organized rebellion. It is not about identity per se, it's about how the environment gives you options. And the black people in the other islands had greater options than they did here. In fact, the point I'm trying to make is that on this little island, the options were fewest because of the perfect survival of the plantocracy. The perfect survival of the plantocracy. And Jamaica, the plantocracy was in shambles, didn't survive. It was in shambles. And it's interesting because if you go through, a classic case of this is to take the same Duke, the Duke of Harewood, who owned 5 sugar plantations in Jamaica and 3 in Barbados. So slavery has come to an end. The Duke of Harewood has 5 plantations in Jamaica. He has 3 in Barbados. His biggest in Barbados is the Bell plantation, which we see on the highway. In Jamaica, his biggest plantation is just outside of Mandeville. What's that community just outside of Mandeville called? No, when you're leaving Mandeville and you're going towards the bauxite plant, there's a town there, a small town. Anyway. What's that? No, not that one. But it will come to me. So, the black people in Jamaica said, Your Lordship, forget it. We are not working for your Lordship anymore. In fact, we want you to break up these plantations and give it to us because we have been working on them for 100 years and they belong to us. They're ours. And the Duke has this information because the workers have told the overseer what to tell the Lord. The overseer writes the letter to the Lord. That's why we have the letter. Writes the letter to the Lord. Your Lordship, your workers have said they're done with you. Now, he sells his Jamaican plantations, takes his cash, brings it to Barbados, and expand his ownership here and produce more sugar in the free period than he did during slavery. So that's an example of how one man functioned. Because he believed, as they all did, that we could control these 83,000 people here. But the 350,000 in Jamaica, we can't control them. So you had the breaking up of the plantation system, the breaking up of the plantations breaking up. Black farmers moved in, and so on. And let me give you an example of that. I remember my first month in Jamaica. And a friend of mine said, oh, come and spend a weekend by my family. I said, fine. So we're driving through the Jamaican countryside. And he said, Hilary, make the next left turn. And I drove past the next left turn. He said, well, I told you make the next left turn. The next left turn was a cart road with royal palms a mile long. Now, I'm a Barbadian. When I see a road with a mile of royal palms down the side, I am socialized to know that at the end of that is a plantation family from Great Britain 200 years ago. But no, it's a black people, because his great-great-grandfather bought that plantation in the 1860s because he was a carpenter, made some money through his skills with fret and all that fancy work, got some cash, the plantation comes on the market, he buys the plantation, so what? There are hundreds of former enslaved people who were buying plantations because the plantations were abandoned. Now, that's a different ecosystem to the one here, where the ex-slaves woke up, they were freed on a Friday, went to church on a Sunday, gave thanks to God for their freedom, as they should, and back to work Monday morning on the same plantation for the same owner for the lowest wages in the Caribbean. You move that mentality through 100 years, and there is a greater sense of defiance in a context where you have had intergenerational success. So the Jamaican black people have had intergenerational success. But here's a fundamental problem between the two islands. And this is an interesting predicament. In the 100 years after emancipation on this island, the black people had no chance of land. Land was not on the agenda. They were landless and they knew it. And the only way they could survive and elevate themselves over the generations was education. Get your children into school, church school, village school, Sunday school, whatever it is, education, education, education. So the black people in Barbados developed a cult of education, a cult of education. In Jamaica now, what actually happened was these formerly enslaved people now have access to massive tracts of land. They have plantations, they have small farms, they have peasant farms, they could produce crops, they can survive. Their living standards are rising because they have food. There is no famine, there is no poverty. There is no famine and below subsistence impoverishment. So 1890s, there is famine in Barbados. Famine. And when I say famine, I'm talking about people who are dying from hunger. There is famine here. We have all the evidence of the famine during the world recession of the 1880s, 1890s. But the Jamaican people are producing crops. They're marketing their crops. They are commercial traders. They're moving the food from town to town. And they are doing well in terms of their material standard of living. But in that environment, it was not conducive to the cult of education. So, the Jamaicans went for economic empowerment, economic access, wealth creation, rising living standards with a lower emphasis on education. Fast forward 100 years. Barbados goes into independence with 98% literacy. Jamaica goes into independence with 30% literacy. Because of that history, because of the wealth access versus the education access. Barbados has no literacy problem. The great Michael Manley dedicated a significant part of his life on an adult literacy campaign. And much of his energy in the 70s and 80s went into getting all the Jamaican people literate, build them up through literacy, because it was a major problem for development. And that has to do with history. History sometimes gives you an option, and the short-term option might be your long-term problem. Your long-term problem might become your asset. So the Barbadian black people came through history with education as an asset. The Jamaican black people came through history with ownership of assets as the asset. And that translates into a different political mentality. And that is how I have tended to look at it. So I found that the Jamaican community in Britain was much more assertive about rights, about access, so that most of the businesses in the black community and so on were Jamaican businesses because they were coming from a tradition of ownership. We, Barbadians, black people, we were not coming from a tradition of ownership. We were coming from a tradition of labor. We were coming from a tradition of labor, and we still have that tradition of labor built into our historical culture. And I think we need to recognize these differences. We work on them because we're on a common journey through time, and sometimes we just have to take stock. So these are stereotypical assumptions. As I said, I have no way of testing them. It's based on my observation.
Can we take one final question?
I'm very curious about how migration itself impacted on the psychological and mental state of many of the immigrants. We have heard remarks of Bajans going overseas and meeting what you call like a cultural shock. And it is claimed, or has been claimed, that some of them have been coming back here what you call like mad. While it is true that we have had what you call like the positive sort of development for the migrants and so on like that, what about the one which has been impacting on them in such a way that we have this psychological and mental state of certain people then not really, say, like reaching what their potential should have been?
Yeah, well, I understand the mad thesis very well because I include myself in that. There is undoubtedly a shift that took place when you move from an agricultural economy into a highly sophisticated industrial economy, and then you return to a non-industrial economy. There's something that happens in that movement. One of the first things that happen is that you realize that the transition has affected your character very profoundly. I still struggle with walking slowly. All of my friends said, the sun is so damn hot. Why are you walking so fast around the place? That is a sign of madness, because in 90 degrees, there's no reason why you should be rushing around the place with your head down. But that became the culture that I was socialized into. Get your head down. And if you are walking, you must walk purposefully. Never walk as if you're drifting. Never walk as if you don't know where you're going. Never walk as if you're wandering. People will think that you're vagrant. You must walk with purpose. Your head down and walk to the place you're going, and walk with a sense of urgency. Now, that is just one example, but take all of the other examples of living in an urban industrial culture. That is very stressful. It is very stressful because the British, as you know, have developed the art of social diplomacy that is devastating. And you know, and a lot of people, I saw it, they struggle with the, hello, John. Good morning. Are you well? Good to see you. And then 2 minutes later, why don't these black people go back where they come from? And a lot of West Indian black people struggle with that duplicity. They couldn't figure out who their friends were. Everyone would greet them very politely and very nicely, but at the same time, they had the other experience. The people who you are working with every day, the shop steward calls an industrial meeting of the union, and all of your English friends who make you a cup of tea in the break go into the union meeting and vote for all the black people to be fired. And 1 minute you're having tea with your English friends every day, good morning, have a cup of tea, and then the next day they vote that you must lose your job. And these West Indians live in that duplicitous world. And they had to develop some very serious skills to differentiate, and they struggle with it. They really struggle with it. And I have seen many of them unable to manage the complexity of that world, mentally stressed, mentally tortured to live in that complex world of friendship and duplicity. And yes, they return home, many of them, having gone through that experience. And if you wish to take it even further, and I'm not a clinical psychologist, but I can understand how you should say, well, listen, first of all, they've come through slavery, and slavery has had its endemic impact on the consciousness of our people. Then after slavery, you had 100 years of apartheid. You had 100 years of apartheid where you can't live here, you can't live here, you can't live here, you can't walk down the street, you can't work in this place. So 200 years of slavery, then 100 years of racial apartheid. And then you go home to the motherland, and you go through another round of that mental torture. One can argue that it is really too much to bear. It really was too much for most people to bear. And understand this also. On these plantations, there were a lot of mad people in the first place. Because the experience of slavery drove many, if not the majority, drove many African people into psychological ill health. And they came out of emancipation with psychological unhealth, no one to give them therapy, no counseling, and then back into the apartheid, more of that psychological torture. So the truth is that what black people have gone through in the Caribbean, arguably no race of people have ever had to endure. And at the end of that, another journey to the mother country to add to that already historically accumulated mental ill health. It really has been too much. So we have been carrying through our history, and we know it, we have been carrying our broken people. Every family, we carry our broken people. We know in our families who are broken. And our people have always known who were broken. Who were broken. I mean, I remember as a child, the most fascinating man in my village, his name was Hitler. And I'm a child, and I couldn't figure out why do they call this man Hitler? And one day I said to my grandfather, why is that gentleman called Hitler? He said, well, 1939, the British government sent recruiting agents into Barbados to recruit people to go and fight the war. And a lot of the young men in the village were signing up to go and join the army to go off and fight the war. And this one young man stood up and said, you all are damn fools. You are going to fight a war to defend the people who enslave us. Hitler didn't enslave us. You guys are fighting on the wrong side. Now, the people in the village immediately brand him Hitler, and that name stuck because he felt that his friends were going to fight on the wrong side. But based on his concept of history, that was his concept of history. And you can say, well, that's a classic case of mental illness, or you can say maybe he was very intuitive. We don't know. But the fact of the matter is that we need to take the subject of mental health care for Afro-Caribbean people. We need to take this subject very seriously. Very seriously indeed. Thank you.
Thanks again, Vice Chancellor. Not only a brilliant lecture, but a lot of stamina for an interesting Q&A. So again, let's give the speaker a round of applause again. Okay, so we're going to bring the proceedings here to a close. I want to thank the Vice Chancellor for a stimulating lecture, much food for thought. I want to thank you, the audience, for being an excellent audience, and invite you to join us again here next week for the next lecture in our series, Barbados Migration to the Guyanas and Trinidad, 19th and 20th Century Narratives by Professor Pedro Welsh. I also invite you to make contact with our Assistant Curator for Social History, Natalie Maguire, if you would like to share your own UK migration stories and experiences with us. I also want to invite the audience to join us for some liquid refreshment. And on your way out, you may also make a contribution to the museum as we continue our work. So again, thank you, good night. Enjoy the refreshments and get home safely. Thanks again.